At exactly 2:41 a.m., a woman pressed record without telling the man sitting across from her. He was calm, too calm for someone who had just paid for an hour of silence. The motel room smelled like cheap cologne and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where people believed nothing they said would ever follow them outside. He leaned back on the bed, loosened his tie, and laughed once. Not nervous, not forced, comfortable. Then he said something that made her stop breathing. "I didn't mean to kill her," he said, "but once it happened, it was easier than I expected." The woman didn't react. She had learned long ago that reactions were dangerous. Her face stayed neutral. Her body stayed still. Her phone, hidden inside her purse, captured every word. The man went on. He talked about the night, about the mistake, about how no one would ever connect him to it. He spoke like he was confessing to a wall. What he didn't know was that the woman listening to him had learned how to survive by remembering everything. Names, voices, patterns, lies. And she knew something else too. Men like him never confess unless they believe they are untouchable. When the hour ended, he paid in cash, smiled politely, and told her to take care. She waited exactly 3 minutes after he left before stopping the recording. She didn't go to the police. Not yet. Because she understood something most people never do. If you reveal a truth too early, it gets buried. 2 days later, the man was reported missing from his office. 3 days later, his wife appeared on television asking for help. And 5 days later, the woman who recorded the confession failed to show up to her usual spot. Her phone was found in a trash bin behind the motel. The memory card was gone. And the only person who knew what had been said in that room had vanished without leaving a trace. What you're about to hear is not a story about innocence or redemption. It's a story about who gets believed, who gets erased, and how some truths become more dangerous than lies the moment they are spoken out loud. In this channel, Crimes Within, we don't focus on criminals who hide in shadows. We focus on crimes that happen inside families, inside relationships, inside closed rooms, where reputation matters more than justice, and silence is treated like loyalty. This story begins with a woman society rarely listens to. She wasn't a witness on a stand. She wasn't a victim with a headline. She wasn't someone the system was designed to protect. She was a prostitute who did what no one expected her to do. She listened carefully. And when a man believed he was safe enough to confess to murder, she made a decision that would quietly place her life on a countdown. As you listen, pay attention to the details that don't feel dramatic, the small choices, the moments where someone could have spoken up, but didn't, because in real crimes, it's not the violence that hides the truth. It's power, shame, and the assumption that certain people can disappear without consequence. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this. Stories that don't rely on spectacle, but on the uncomfortable reality of how crimes actually unfold. And let me ask you something important. Where are you watching from right now? A city, a small town, another country entirely? Leave a comment, because stories like this don't belong to one place. They happen everywhere. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To the woman who pressed record. To the man who believed he was untouchable. And to the decision that made both of them targets. She didn't start recording because she was brave. She started recording because she was tired of being invisible. Her name, at least the one she used, was Lena. Not because it was real, but because it was forgettable, easy to say, easy to replace. She learned early that men remembered bodies, not names, and she made sure her name never mattered enough to stick. The motel sat just off the highway, close enough to the city to attract business, far enough to avoid attention. No cameras in the hallway, no questions at the front desk. A place designed for people who wanted their lives neatly separated. The client had arrived just after midnight, expensive shoes, clean watch. The kind of man who didn't look around when he entered a room because he assumed the room already belonged to him. He didn't give a name. He never did. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how quickly he relaxed. Within minutes he was talking about work, about pressure, about how exhausting it was to keep everything together. Lena listened the way she always did, nodding in the right places, never interrupting. She had learned that men paid more when they felt heard. The confession didn't come all at once. It slipped out sideways. A joke about someone who wouldn't be a problem anymore. A comment about how accidents weren't always accidents. A laugh that came half a second too late. Lena's instincts tightened. She had grown up in a house where silence meant danger. She recognized the tone, the way people spoke when they believed they were untouchable. That's when she shifted her purse slightly and pressed record. The man didn't notice. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and spoke like someone rehearsing a story he'd already told himself 100 times. He described a woman, not by name, but by inconvenience. She kept pushing, he said. You know how people get. Lena didn't answer. She wasn't supposed to fall, he continued. That part surprised me. The room felt smaller. He talked about how easy it was to clean up, about favors owed, about how no one asks questions when the right people don't want answers. Lena's heart pounded, but her face didn't change. When he finished, there was a pause. Not awkward, satisfied. He checked his phone, stood up, adjusted his jacket, and placed the cash on the dresser like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Funny thing, he said casually. Once you cross a line, it stops feeling like a line. Then he left. Lena locked the door behind him and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. She replayed the recording once. Only once. That was enough. She knew exactly what she was holding. And she also knew something far more important. If she went straight to the police, the story would turn against her before it ever touched him. A prostitute. An unnamed client, a secret recording. She'd seen how that ended. So she waited. She backed up the file. She hid one copy somewhere she could reach. She gave another copy to someone she trusted, not with instructions, just with a warning. If something happens to me, don't delete this. She didn't plan to disappear, but she planned for the possibility. 2 days later, she saw his face on a screen, a missing person report. A respected professional, a man described as devoted and reliable. His wife spoke to reporters with practiced grief. Colleagues expressed shock. Friends said the same phrase over and over. He would never hurt anyone. Lena turned off the TV because she knew exactly who he could hurt. And she knew what people like him did when they realized a secret had escaped the room it was born in. That night, a black sedan parked across the street from the motel for almost an hour. No one got out. The next morning, Lena didn't show up to work. The motel manager assumed she'd moved on. Women like her often did. By evening, her phone stopped connecting to the network. And by the time anyone noticed she was gone, the only physical evidence she had ever existed there was a single key card left behind in room 214. Inside that room, nothing was disturbed. No signs of struggle, no blood, no broken objects. Just the sense, felt more than seen, that someone had taken great care to make her absence look ordinary. But ordinary was the one thing Lena's disappearance wasn't, because somewhere, outside that motel, there was a recording. And somewhere else, someone knew she had it. The investigation began where it always did, with the wrong assumptions. When the man's disappearance became impossible to ignore, police treated it as a voluntary absence, a stressed executive, a midlife crisis, a man who needed space. His bank accounts remained untouched, but that detail was quietly set aside. His car was found parked neatly in his company's underground garage, keys inside, nothing out of place. Too clean. But clean scenes often convinced people there was nothing to see. Detectives interviewed his wife first. She cried at the right moments. She spoke in complete sentences. She emphasized how stable their life had been, how loving he was, how impossible it felt that he would vanish without warning. She never mentioned arguments. She never mentioned threats. She never mentioned the woman who had accused him months earlier of harassment and then quietly withdrew her statement. That file stayed buried. Instead, police turned outward. Co-workers, friends, neighbors, everyone repeated the same story. Respected, reliable, generous. The kind of man who donated to charities and mentored young professionals. The kind of man who smiled easily and made people feel small without raising his voice. No one mentioned motel rooms. No one asked where he spent his nights. And no one, absolutely no one, asked who might have heard him speak without a filter. Lena's disappearance didn't register as connected. When the motel manager eventually mentioned that a woman had stopped showing up around the same time, the officer taking notes barely looked up. "These things happen," he said. "Transient lifestyle." A missing executive was news. A missing prostitute was background noise. But someone else noticed the timing. A junior detective named Morales had been assigned to review phone metadata. He wasn't looking for patterns, just anomalies. Something to close the file cleanly. That's when he saw it. A single outgoing call from the missing man's phone at 2:38 a.m. 3 nights before he vanished. The number didn't belong to a business contact. It wasn't saved. It had no name attached. The call lasted 7 minutes. Morales flagged it. When he asked his supervisor about pursuing it, the response was immediate and dismissive. "Dead end," he was told. "Probably personal." Morales didn't argue. He waited, and when he ran the number through a secondary database, he found it had been active near the motel district. Prepaid, unregistered. The number belonged to Lena. Morales didn't know her name yet, only that the number went dark 2 days after the executive disappeared. That coincidence was enough to bother him. He drove past the motel on his lunch break. Room 214 was empty. The manager said she'd checked out without notice, left a key, no personal belongings, no forwarding information. Morales asked if anyone had visited her. The manager hesitated. "There was a man," she said slowly. "Not the client. Another one. Came asking questions, said he was a cousin." Morales's stomach tightened. "When?" "Day after she stopped coming in." Morales wrote that down. Back at the station, he searched missing persons reports that hadn't made the news. Women, unstable housing, no family pushing for answers. That's when he found Lena, or at least the version of her the system allowed to exist. Age approximate. No last name, no photograph, no active investigation. Just a line that read, "Possible voluntary absence." Morales closed the file and leaned back in his chair. He understood the message. This wasn't a case anyone wanted reopened. Meanwhile, the executive's family hired a private investigator. Not to find him. To control the narrative. They wanted proof he hadn't run away with money. They wanted reassurance. They wanted closure, but only the kind that preserved reputation. The investigator traced the executive's final movements. He found the motel. He found room 214. And unlike the police, he didn't dismiss it. He requested access to the room under the pretense of personal inquiry. Inside, he noticed something small, a scuff mark near the outlet. A place where something had been plugged in repeatedly. Phones leave traces. He asked the manager if Lena owned a phone. "She always had one," the manager said. "Never let it leave her purse." The investigator didn't report that to the family. Instead, he made a call of his own. That same evening, the black sedan returned, not to the motel, to a self-storage facility on the outskirts of town. Inside a rented unit, paid in cash, sat a single item wrapped carefully in plastic, a phone. The investigator didn't know what was on it yet, but he knew enough to understand that this wasn't about finding a missing man. It was about containing a story. Morales, working late that night, received an anonymous email. No message, no explanation, just an audio file, 30 seconds long. He put on headphones. He heard a man's voice, confident, relaxed, speaking about a woman who wouldn't be a problem anymore. Morales froze. The file cut off abruptly. Attached was a single line of text. If something happens to me, this explains why. Morales looked at the sender's address. It had been created that morning, and it went inactive 5 minutes after the email was sent. For the first time since the case began, Morales understood the scale of what had happened. This wasn't one crime. It was a chain reaction, a confession that wasn't meant to survive. A woman who understood its value, and a system that erased her faster than it pursued the truth. Morales didn't forward the file. He copied it, he backed it up, and then he did the one thing Lena had known someone would eventually have to do. He stopped trusting the process, because now there were 2 missing people, and only one of them had been important enough to make headlines. Morales didn't sleep, not because he was afraid, because the audio file had changed the shape of everything. A missing executive wasn't just missing. He was a man who'd spoken like death was a solved problem. And Lena wasn't just gone. She was a woman who'd predicted her own erasure and tried to outsmart it. Morales listened to the 30 seconds again, this time with a pen in his hand, writing down every breath, every pause, every verbal habit. The voice carried the kind of confidence that didn't come from impulse. It came from rehearsal. He compared it to a corporate keynote video he found online, an old clip of the missing executive speaking at a charity event. The cadence matched. Not perfectly, but enough. Morales knew what his supervisor would say if he brought this forward. Unverified source, unlawful recording, lifestyle witness, a polite way of saying, don't ruin a clean narrative with a messy person. So Morales didn't go up the chain. He went sideways. He brought the file to a colleague in internal affairs, a woman named Lillian Park, who'd built her reputation on not being impressed by status. She didn't like Morales. She didn't dislike him either. She just didn't tolerate shortcuts. She listened to the audio once, then removed her headphones slowly. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "An anonymous email," Morales said, "and the number the executive called that night went dark. It traces back to a woman at a motel. She disappeared right after he did." Park's eyes stayed fixed on him. "You understand what you're saying?" Morales nodded. "Someone confessed to murder. A woman recorded it. Then both of them vanished." Park leaned back. "And you think your department will treat that woman like a priority?" Morales didn't answer, because the answer was obvious. Park drummed her fingers on the desk, then said, "If this is real, the first threat isn't the killer. It's the people who benefit from keeping it unreal." That sentence landed like a weight, because in crimes like this, the cover-up didn't begin after the act. It began the moment the truth became inconvenient. Park ran a discreet request for the executive's case file access logs, who viewed it, who downloaded attachments, who pulled related reports. The list was longer than it should have been for a missing person. It included a name Morales didn't recognize, a private investigator. Park frowned. "Why would a private investigator have access to departmental timestamps?" she asked, more to herself than to Morales. Morales swallowed. "The family hired one." Park's gaze sharpened. "Families don't get access to our system." She made a call, quiet, short, and returned with a new expression that Morales didn't like. "The PI isn't just a PI," she said. "He's ex-law enforcement, retired early, still has friends." Morales exhaled slowly. "So he's not looking for the executive?" Park tapped the desk once. "He's looking for what the executive left behind." Morales thought of Lena's phone, her purse, her backup. Then Park said something that made Morales' skin go cold. "Your anonymous sender knew you wouldn't trust command," she said, "which means they either know you or they've studied you." Morales stared at her. "You think this was aimed at me?" "I think," Park replied, "whoever sent it wanted a specific type of person holding it, someone who wouldn't hand it to the wrong desk." Morales didn't feel flattered. He felt targeted. That afternoon, Park pulled the motel manager into an informal conversation. No uniforms, no badges. She offered coffee and asked gentle questions, the kind that made people speak more because they felt safe. The manager's hands shook slightly when Park asked about the man who'd claimed to be a cousin. He didn't look like family, the manager said. He looked like someone who was paid to be polite. What did he ask? Park pressed. If she had a phone, the manager admitted. If she kept it on her, if she had a boyfriend, if she'd ever said she was scared. Park's eyes narrowed. Did he threaten you? The manager hesitated. No, he didn't need to. He just smiled like he already knew I'd cooperate. Park thanked her, left, and sat in her car for a long minute without starting the engine. Then she said, "They're cleaning." Morales stared at her. Cleaning what? Park's voice was quiet. Loose ends. People, evidence, narratives. Back at the station, Morales returned to his desk and found something waiting for him that hadn't been there earlier. A small envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just his name printed in neat block letters. Inside was a cheap motel keycard. Room 214. Morales's throat tightened. A keycard wasn't proof. It wasn't even evidence by itself. It was a message. We know you went there. We know you're holding something. Stop. Morales turned slowly in his chair and looked across the office. He couldn't spot anyone watching him, because people who watch you properly don't look like they're watching. Park read the tension on his face immediately. What is it? Morales slid the keycard across her desk. Park didn't touch it at first. She stared at it like it could bite. Then she said, "They're not just aware. They're close." That night, Park arranged something Morales didn't expect. A meeting with the executive's wife. Not official, not documented. It happened in a quiet diner outside city limits, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired and honest. The wife arrived in a long coat, hair pinned perfectly, eyes red in a controlled way, like she'd practiced grief the same way she practiced manners. Park didn't waste time. "I need to ask you a question," she said. "Did your husband ever mention someone at a motel?" The wife's eyes narrowed. "No." Park watched her carefully. "Did he ever mention a woman who recorded him?" The wife's face didn't change much, but her hand tightened around her coffee cup. "What are you implying?" she asked, voice smooth. Park leaned in slightly. "I'm implying your husband didn't disappear," she said. "He was removed." The wife's expression hardened. "That's absurd." Park placed her phone on the table and played the 30-second audio. The wife listened without moving. When it ended, she didn't cry. She didn't panic. She smiled, small and chilling. "That could be anyone," she said. Park's eyes narrowed. "It's his voice." The wife shrugged lightly. "Voices can be faked," she replied. Morales felt his stomach drop, because denial was normal, but prepared denial was something else. Park's voice stayed calm. "If someone's faking your husband's voice, you should want to know who." The wife's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I want my husband found," she said, "and I want people like you to stop harassing my family with rumors." Park held her gaze. "People like me?" The wife leaned closer, lowering her voice like she was sharing advice. "You're not as protected as you think," she said. Then she stood, paid the bill in cash, and left without looking back. Park sat perfectly still. Morales whispered, "That wasn't grief." Park nodded once, eyes cold now. "No," she said. "That was a warning." And somewhere in the city, the private investigator opened a sealed storage unit and held Lena's phone in his gloved hand. He didn't know the recording was already moving. He didn't know Morales had a copy. He didn't know Park had just drawn a line, but he did know one thing. If the wrong people heard the truth, the entire family name would collapse. So he made a call. Quiet, professional, efficient. And the person on the other end asked a simple question. Who has the file? The motel footage vanished overnight, not corrupted, not mislabeled, deleted. When Morales arrived at the station the next morning, the request log showed his credentials had accessed the files at 3:12 a.m. A time he had been home, asleep, phone charging on his kitchen counter. Someone had used his badge, and whoever did it understood procedure well enough to make it look careless instead of deliberate. Morales felt the room tilt slightly as the realization settled in. The case wasn't being slowed down, it was being redirected. His supervisor called him in before he could even sit down. "You accessed evidence outside protocol," the supervisor said, tone neutral, eyes already tired of the conversation he was about to have. "I didn't," Morales replied calmly. The supervisor slid a printout across the desk. "Timestamp, access code, Morales's ID. Looks like you did." Morales didn't argue. Arguing would turn suspicion into certainty. Instead, he said, "Then you should check the camera logs." The supervisor hesitated. There were cameras everywhere, except in the one hallway leading to the evidence room. A renovation oversight. A blind spot everyone knew about, and no one fixed. The supervisor leaned back. "This isn't a hill you want to die on." Morales met his gaze. "I'm not choosing the hill," he said. "Someone else already did." By lunchtime, Morales's access was restricted, pending review. Not suspended, not fired, isolated. Park noticed immediately. "They're freezing you out," she said quietly in the stairwell. "That means they're nervous." Morales exhaled. "Or confident." Park shook her head. "Confident people don't rush." She pulled out her phone and showed him a message she'd received that morning. A single sentence from an unknown number. "You're protecting the wrong woman." Park's jaw tightened. "They think Lena was disposable," she said. "That tells me they never listened to her." Morales felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. "They don't know about the second copy," he said. Park looked at him sharply. "There was a second copy." Morales nodded. "She planned for this." He didn't tell Park where the backup was yet. Not because he didn't trust her, but because the fewer people who knew, the better. That afternoon, the private investigator met with the executive's brother in a law office that specialized in reputation management. No phones allowed, no windows. The PI placed Lena's phone on the table. "I have the original device," he said, "but the file's already out there." The brother stiffened. "Where?" "We don't know," the PI replied, "which means we need to assume law enforcement has it." The brother's voice dropped. "Handle it," the PI nodded. "Already in progress." Across town, Morales sat in his car, watching the storage facility from across the street. He hadn't come there for evidence. He'd come there because Lena's friend, the one she trusted, had finally returned his call. "She said if anything happened," the woman told Morales over the phone, voice shaking, "to check the place with the blue door, the one with the broken lock." Morales had asked why she hadn't gone sooner. "I was scared," she admitted, "but I'm more scared now." The storage unit wasn't the blue door, it was the locker beside it. Inside was a shoebox. Inside the shoebox was a cheap USB drive wrapped in duct tape, and on that drive was the full recording. Not 30 seconds, 43 minutes. Morales sat in his car and listened to the entire thing. He heard the beginning, the small talk, the jokes. He heard the middle, where the man's voice shifted from casual to careless, and he heard the end. That's where the confession stopped sounding like bragging and started sounding like planning. "People like her don't get believed," the man said calmly. "If she ever tried to talk, she'd disappear before the story did." Morales's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Because the man hadn't been predicting the future, he'd been describing it. Morales didn't send the file to Park, he sent it somewhere else. A journalist, not a crime reporter, not a tabloid. An investigative journalist known for one thing, refusing to kill stories when threatened. Within hours, the journalist replied with 2 words, "I'm listening." That same evening, the executive's wife received a call. Not from police, from the PI. "It's moved," he said. "We need to act." Her voice stayed calm. "Then act." He hesitated. If this goes public, it won't just be him. It will be the family. There was a pause on the line. Then she said something that confirmed everything Park suspected. Then make sure it doesn't go public, she replied, at any cost. The journalist met Morales and Park the next morning in a parking garage that smelled like oil and rain. She listened to the recording once. Then she looked up and said, "This isn't a missing person story." Morales nodded. "It's a murder confession." "And the woman who recorded it?" the journalist asked. Park's voice was steady. "Erased." The journalist exhaled. "They'll come after this." Morales leaned forward. "They already have." The journalist smiled faintly. "Good. That means they're scared." She stood. "Give me 48 hours. Morales watched her leave, knowing that once the story broke, there would be no way to put it back into silence. That night, the private investigator was pulled over for a minor traffic violation. Inside his trunk, police found Lena's phone. The PI claimed ignorance. But ignorance doesn't explain fingerprints, and it doesn't explain why he'd wiped the device clean, except for one corrupted file fragment. A fragment that ended with a sentence the system hadn't expected anyone else to hear. "If I disappear, it's because I told the truth." By morning, the executive's wife's lawyer was calling every newsroom in the city. By afternoon, the journalist's article went live. And by nightfall, the story was no longer about a missing man. It was about a woman who had been right and paid for it. And for the first time since Lena pressed record, the truth had outrun the people trying to bury it. The arrest didn't begin with sirens. They began with silence. Phones stopped being answered. Meetings were cancelled without explanation. People who had spoken confidently for weeks suddenly asked their lawyers to handle everything. When the journalist's article went live, it didn't accuse anyone directly. It didn't need to. It did something far more dangerous. It connected timelines. The article laid out dates, locations, and decisions with surgical calm. The executive's last confirmed movements, Lena's disappearance, the deleted motel footage, the private investigator's access to police systems. The corrupted phone recovered from his trunk. No speculation, no dramatic language, just facts arranged in a way that made denial feel childish. By mid-morning, the police department's leadership realized they had a problem they could no longer manage internally. Because this wasn't just about a murder, it was about who helped make it disappear. Internal Affairs opened a parallel investigation, quietly at first. Park was officially assigned to it, not because command trusted her, but because moving her out of the building kept her from asking questions in public hallways. She accepted without comment. Morales was placed on administrative leave, not for misconduct, for his own safety. That phrase told him everything he needed to know. "You're not suspended," his supervisor said carefully. "You're protected." Morales nodded, already understanding the subtext. Protected people don't get access. Protected people don't talk. Protected people wait. But Morales wasn't waiting anymore. The journalist called him that afternoon. "They're panicking," she said. "I've had 3 separate sources call me to clarify context. That's not clarification. That's damage control." Morales leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "They'll try to discredit Lena." "They already are," the journalist replied. "They're framing her as unstable, claiming the recording was manipulated." Morales closed his eyes. "Of course they are. But here's the thing," the journalist continued. "They didn't anticipate one problem." Morales opened his eyes. "Witches. They assumed she was alone." Park encountered resistance immediately. Requests for file access were delayed. Documents arrived incomplete. Names were redacted for privacy. Every obstruction was polite, professional, and intentional. But obstruction leaves fingerprints. Park traced the motel footage deletion back to a temporary credential issued late at night, one that should never have existed. It had been approved manually, by a captain 2 levels above Morales. Park requested an interview. The captain declined. That refusal went into her report. Then Park did something risky. She went around the department. She contacted a federal oversight office that specialized in corruption, not murder. Because this case wasn't about violence anymore. It was about institutional behavior, and institutions panic when you threaten their structure. Meanwhile, the executive's wife stopped answering calls. Her lawyer issued a statement expressing deep concern about misinformation and announcing legal action against unnamed parties for defamation. It was a mistake, because legal threats create paper trails, and paper trails invite scrutiny. Investigators subpoenaed the private investigators' records. They found payments routed through shell companies, retainers paid in advance, communications that weren't about finding a missing man, but about controlling exposure. One email stood out. "We need to neutralize the secondary narrative before it becomes primary." Secondary narrative. That was Lena. That was her life reduced to an inconvenience. When the PI was formally charged, not with murder, but with obstruction, he asked for a deal within hours. He didn't ask to be protected. He asked to be believed. "They told me she was a liability," he said in a recorded interview. "They said if the recording surfaced, it would destroy the family. My job was to locate the device and contain it." "Contain how?" the interviewer asked. The PI swallowed. "However necessary." He never admitted to harming Lena directly. He didn't have to, because he named the people who had created the conditions that made her disappearance possible: the executive's brother, the family's legal counsel, the captain who authorized off-hours access, people who didn't touch her, but ensured no one would look for her properly. Morales watched the news coverage from his apartment, phone buzzing constantly with messages he wasn't supposed to answer. When the executive's wife was brought in for questioning, cameras captured her entering the building without expression. Still composed, still dignified, but something had shifted. This time, no one was protecting her from context. Park sat in on the interview, not as an interrogator, but as an observer. She watched the wife carefully, noting what she avoided more than what she said. The wife denied everything, denied knowledge of the motel, denied awareness of Lena, denied authorizing any cover-up. But when asked why her family hired a PI with access to police systems instead of cooperating with investigators, she hesitated, just long enough. Park marked the moment. That pause wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Outside the building, the journalist published a follow-up. This one focused entirely on Lena, her routine, her precautions, her decision to record. And for the first time, the public heard her voice, not as a victim, but as a witness who had understood the risk and acted anyway. The response was immediate. People shared the story not because it was shocking, but because it felt familiar. Too familiar. Messages poured in from women who had been dismissed, from people whose complaints had been buried, from families who recognized the pattern. The story grew larger than the individuals involved. It became about who society decides is credible, and once that question took hold, the family's position began to collapse. Sponsors withdrew support, boards requested resignations, associates distanced themselves. The executive's legacy, so carefully constructed, began to unravel. But Lena was still missing. No body, no confirmation, just absence. Morales met Park one evening at the diner where they'd first confronted the wife. "She planned for this," Morales said quietly. "She knew she might not survive it." Park nodded. "And she made sure the truth would." Morales stared into his coffee. "Is that enough?" Park didn't answer right away. "No," she said finally. "But it's what we have." That night, the journalist received one final anonymous message. A location, a time, and 3 words. She didn't run. The message disappeared seconds after it was read. And somewhere in the city, someone realized they'd made the same mistake the executive had made in that motel room. They assumed silence meant safety. The location in the anonymous message wasn't dramatic. No abandoned warehouse, no remote forest, no shallow grave marked by guilt or haste. It was a stretch of land behind an industrial drainage canal, hidden between a recycling plant and a defunct rail spur. Exactly the kind of place no one searches unless they already know what they're looking for. Morales stood behind the police tape as floodlights illuminated the uneven ground. He recognized the efficiency immediately. This wasn't a panic disposal. It was planned. Investigators found a shallow burial site reinforced with construction debris, designed to collapse inward over time. No markers, no personal items. Whoever placed her there had intended the earth to finish the job. Lena was identified through dental records within hours. The autopsy confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. She had been killed shortly after her disappearance. No prolonged struggle. No signs of chaos, just controlled force. Someone had wanted her gone, not punished, not interrogated, erased. The moment the cause of death was confirmed, the case changed classification. This was no longer a missing persons investigation connected to a murder confession. It was a silencing homicide. The executive's wife was arrested the same afternoon, not for murder, for conspiracy. The evidence was devastating in its simplicity. Call logs between her and the private investigator spiked in the hours after Lena disappeared. Financial transfers aligned with the PI's movements. Emails showed instructions disguised as legal language, phrases like risk mitigation and narrative containment. She maintained her composure through the arrest. No outburst, no denial. Only one question, asked quietly as she was escorted away. Did it work? The officer didn't answer, because by then it clearly hadn't. During interrogation, the PI broke fully. He described how he'd tracked Lena using her phone habits, how he'd approached her under the pretense of being a relative, how she'd refused to hand over the recording. "She told me," he said, voice shaking, "if I disappear, you'll prove me right." He admitted he'd arranged the meeting location. He admitted he'd hired someone else to handle it. And most damning of all, he admitted he'd underestimated her. She had already given the file away, he said. "I didn't know that until it was too late." The person who physically killed Lena was arrested within 48 hours. A contractor with no connection to the executive's family on paper, but a long history of being paid to make problems vanish. He didn't resist. He didn't deny involvement. He only said one thing during questioning. "I was told she didn't matter." That sentence traveled fast. It appeared in court filings. It appeared in news articles. It appeared on signs during protests outside the courthouse. Because it summarized the entire case better than any legal argument ever could. Morales testified anonymously at the preliminary hearing. Park testified publicly. The journalist published the final installment of the story under a headline that avoided names entirely. She recorded the truth. The system tried to bury it. The executive's reputation collapsed completely. Past complaints resurfaced. Former employees came forward. Patterns emerged that had been ignored for years. The confession Lena recorded wasn't an anomaly. It was confirmation. The trial took months. Convictions followed, not just for the murder, but for obstruction, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and abuse of authority. The executive himself was officially declared deceased. His remains never recovered. The confession he'd believed was safe inside a motel room became the defining record of his life. Lena's name was finally spoken in court, not as a footnote, not as an accessory, as the reason everything unraveled. At her memorial, there were no grand speeches, just people who hadn't known her well, but knew exactly what she'd done. Morales stood at the back, listening. Park stood beside him. "She didn't trust the system," Morales said quietly. Park nodded. "She trusted evidence." That night, Morales returned home and opened the folder he'd kept hidden since the beginning. Inside was the first 30 seconds of the recording, the part no one ever played publicly, the part where Lena's voice could be heard, barely audible, saying, "Just talk, I'm listening." Morales closed the folder, because the case was over. But the question it raised wasn't. How many people like Lena never get a chance to press record? How many confessions stay hidden because the wrong person hears them? How many disappearances are called coincidence because it's easier than facing what they mean? The system had been forced to act this time, not because it wanted to, because someone who was supposed to be invisible refused to stay silent. And that refusal, captured in a motel room at 2:41 a.m., had been louder than power, money, and fear combined. Lena had known the cost. She paid it anyway. And because of that, the truth survived her, even when she didn't. The location in the anonymous message wasn't dramatic. No abandoned warehouse, no remote forest, no shallow grave marked by guilt or haste. It was a stretch of land behind an industrial drainage canal, hidden between a recycling plant and a defunct rail spur. Exactly the kind of place no one searches unless they already know what they're looking for. Morales stood behind the police tape as floodlights illuminated the uneven ground. He recognized the efficiency immediately. This wasn't a panic disposal. It was planned. Investigators found a shallow burial site reinforced with construction debris designed to collapse inward over time. No markers, no personal items. Whoever placed her there had intended the earth to finish the job. Lena was identified through dental records within hours. The autopsy confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. She had been killed shortly after her disappearance. No prolonged struggle, no signs of chaos, just controlled force. Someone had wanted her gone, not punished, not interrogated, erased. The moment the cause of death was confirmed, the case changed classification. This was no longer a missing persons investigation connected to a murder confession. It was a silencing homicide. The executive's wife was arrested the same afternoon, not for murder, for conspiracy. The evidence was devastating in its simplicity. Call logs between her and the private investigator spiked in the hours after Lena disappeared. Financial transfers aligned with the PI's movements. Emails showed instructions disguised as legal language, phrases like risk mitigation and narrative containment. She maintained her composure through the arrest. No outburst, no denial. Only one question, asked quietly as she was escorted away. Did it work? The officer didn't answer, because by then it clearly hadn't. During interrogation, the PI broke fully. He described how he'd tracked Lena using her phone habits, how he'd approached her under the pretense of being a relative, how she'd refused to hand over the recording. "She told me," he said, voice shaking, "if I disappear, you'll prove me right." He admitted he'd arranged the meeting location. He admitted he'd hired someone else to handle it. And most damning of all, he admitted he'd underestimated her. She had already given the file away, he said. "I didn't know that until it was too late." The person who physically killed Lena was arrested within 48 hours. A contractor with no connection to the executive's family on paper, but a long history of being paid to make problems vanish. He didn't resist. He didn't deny involvement. He only said one thing during questioning. "I was told she didn't matter." That sentence traveled fast. It appeared in court filings. It appeared in news articles. It appeared on signs during protests outside the courthouse. Because it summarized the entire case better than any legal argument ever could. Morales testified anonymously at the preliminary hearing. Park testified publicly. The journalist published the final installment of the story under a headline that avoided names entirely. She recorded the truth. The system tried to bury it. The executive's reputation collapsed completely. Past complaints resurfaced. Former employees came forward. Patterns emerged that had been ignored for years. The confession Lena recorded wasn't an anomaly. It was confirmation. The trial took months. Convictions followed, not just for the murder, but for obstruction, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and abuse of authority. The executive himself was officially declared deceased, his remains never recovered. The confession he'd believed was safe inside a motel room became the defining record of his life. Lena's name was finally spoken in court, not as a footnote, not as an accessory, as the reason everything unraveled. At her memorial, there were no grand speeches, just people who hadn't known her well, but knew exactly what she'd done. Morales stood at the back, listening. Park stood beside him. "She didn't trust the system," Morales said quietly. Park nodded. "She trusted evidence." That night, Morales returned home and opened the folder he'd kept hidden since the beginning. Inside was the first 30 seconds of the recording, the part no one ever played publicly, the part where Lena's voice could be heard, barely audible, saying, "Just talk, I'm listening." Morales closed the folder, because the case was over. But the question it raised wasn't. How many people like Lena never get a chance to press record? How many confessions stay hidden because the wrong person hears them? How many disappearances are called coincidence because it's easier than facing what they mean? The system had been forced to act this time, not because it wanted to, because someone who was supposed to be invisible refused to stay silent. And that refusal, captured in a motel room at 2:41 a.m., had been louder than power, money, and fear combined. Lena had known the cost. She paid it anyway. And because of that, the truth survived her, even when she didn't. The city didn't react the way anyone expected. There were no riots, no mass outrage in the streets, no sudden awakening that made everything feel resolved. Instead, there was something quieter and far more unsettling. People recognized the pattern. Talk shows debated it carefully. Comment sections filled with sentences that started the same way. "This reminds me of..." Lawyers spoke about precedent. Advocacy groups pointed to past cases that had followed the same arc and ended without names ever being spoken. Lena's story didn't shock because it was extreme. It shocked because it was familiar. Morales felt that shift immediately. Messages arrived from strangers who weren't asking questions. They were offering fragments, stories of recordings deleted, complaints buried, witnesses reframed as unstable, people who had learned the hard way that truth didn't matter unless it came from the right mouth. The system hadn't failed. It had functioned exactly as designed. Park, now fully embedded in the oversight investigation, reviewed internal emails that no one expected to become public. Language mattered more than actions. Words like risk exposure, narrative volatility, and collateral credibility damage appeared again and again. Lena's name never did. She was referred to as the secondary individual. Park highlighted that phrase in red, because once you reduce a human being to a category, everything that follows becomes easier to justify. The executive's family lawyer resigned quietly, not in protest, not in shame, in calculation. He released a statement citing health reasons, then disappeared into consultancy work overseas. No charges were filed against him, not because he was innocent, but because proving intent would require dragging an entire legal culture into the light. And cultures don't like being examined. Morales watched as the case became something larger than criminal responsibility. It evolved into a question institutions tried to answer without using the word guilt. Who authorized access? Who approved deletions? Who looked away? The answers weren't dramatic. They were procedural. A captain who signed off without reading. A supervisor who trusted the wrong person. A clerk who assumed someone else had verified the request. No single villain, just a ladder of quiet decisions. The executive's wife remained silent. Her attorney advised her to cooperate partially, answering questions without volunteering context. She complied perfectly. She acknowledged calls without discussing content. She confirmed payments without stating purpose. She spoke like someone who understood that truth wasn't binary, it was negotiable. Park noticed one thing, though. Whenever Lena's name came up, the wife's posture changed. Not fear, not grief, contempt. That detail stayed with Park, because contempt requires recognition, and recognition meant Lena had been seen as a threat long before she disappeared. Public pressure mounted slowly. Sponsors cut ties with the executive's former company. Boards issued statements that said nothing and apologized for everything. Training programs were announced. Committees formed, the usual aftermath. Morales received permission to return to the station, but not to the case. He was reassigned to administrative review, a polite exile designed to keep him useful but distant. He accepted it, because distance gave him something he hadn't had before: time. He spent it reviewing archived cases with similarities, missing witnesses, discredited recordings, investigations that collapsed once credibility issues were raised. There were more than he expected. In one case, a hotel worker disappeared after reporting a powerful guest. In another, a cleaner who overheard something she wasn't supposed to vanished between shifts. Each file ended the same way: insufficient evidence. Morales realized Lena hadn't been unique. She had been prepared. She'd known exactly what would happen once she pressed record. She'd known that survival wasn't guaranteed, but permanence was possible. Park came to the same conclusion independently. She treated evidence like inheritance, Park said during one of their late-night calls. Something passed on when you know you won't be there to defend it. That insight changed how Park framed the report. She stopped writing about failures. She wrote about intentional vulnerability, about a system that required certain people to risk everything just to be heard. When the oversight report was released, it didn't name Lena as a victim. It named her as a whistleblower. That distinction mattered. It reframed her actions from desperation to strategy. The executive's family attempted a final maneuver, filing a civil suit claiming reputational harm caused by illegally obtained material. The judge dismissed it in less than 10 minutes. The recording's legality is not the issue, the judge said. Its relevance is. That sentence traveled farther than any headline, because relevance is what the system often denies. In a small ceremony organized by people who hadn't known Lena personally, a plaque was placed near the motel. No last name, no photograph, just a sentence. She listened when someone confessed, and refused to disappear quietly. Morales stood there after the crowd left. He thought about the night Lena pressed record, about how she must have known that once she did, her life would start shrinking around that decision. But she did it anyway. Not because she expected justice, because she refused to let the truth be comfortable. And comfort, Morales had learned, was the most dangerous accomplice of all. The family's final mistake came quietly. No press conference, no legal threat, no dramatic confrontation. They tried to close the loop. A month after the oversight report was released, a sealed motion was filed requesting the court to restrict further public reference to the case under the argument of ongoing harm to uninvolved parties. The language was careful, almost sympathetic. It positioned the family as exhausted, wounded, and unfairly targeted by a narrative that had already served its purpose. That phrase, served its purpose, caught Park's attention immediately. Because truth doesn't have a purpose in systems like this. It has a lifespan. Park requested access to the motion's attachments. Buried beneath pages of legal framing was a familiar pattern. Emails attempting to redefine Lena's role. Not a witness, not a whistleblower, a provocateur. Someone who had created risk by recording without consent. They weren't trying to deny the recording anymore. They were trying to reframe blame. Morales read the filing late one night, sitting alone in his apartment. He noticed something Park had missed at first, a name attached to the motion's approval chain. The same captain, the one who had authorized off-hours access, the one who'd never been charged, the one who had quietly retired with full benefits 2 weeks earlier. Morales called Park immediately. "They're still protecting him," he said. Park exhaled slowly. "Or he's still protecting them." That was when the Oversight Office made its move. Not public, not loud, procedural. They reopened 3 dormant internal cases connected to the same approval signature. Different cities, different departments. Same method, quiet authorization, missing footage, witnesses labeled unreliable. The pattern snapped into focus. This wasn't a one-time failure, it was a model. The captain was subpoenaed. For the first time since the case began, someone in a position of authority looked genuinely afraid. During testimony, he denied intent, denied knowledge, denied coordination. But denial doesn't survive timestamps. He couldn't explain why his approvals clustered around cases involving vulnerable witnesses. He couldn't explain why deletions always occurred during the same time window. He couldn't explain why private investigators hired by wealthy families had access paths no civilian should have. When asked about Lena, he paused, just like the executive's wife had. The oversight attorney didn't press immediately. She let the silence do the work. Finally, the captain said, "I didn't know what would happen to her." The attorney's response was precise. "You knew what wouldn't." That answer echoed, because that was the truth no one wanted to own. They hadn't ordered Lena's death. They had simply removed every barrier that might have prevented it. The motion to restrict references was denied, and that denial changed everything. Because now, the case wasn't just allowed to be discussed, it was protected. Academic panels began analyzing it. Law schools taught it as an example of institutional complicity without conspiracy. Media ethics courses debated the journalist's decision to publish the full recording. And slowly, something unexpected happened. People started coming forward before they disappeared. A hotel receptionist turned in a recording she'd been afraid to share. A caregiver submitted messages she'd saved for years. A warehouse worker handed over a voicemail he'd assumed no one would believe. Not all of them led to arrests, but all of them forced documentation. Morales watched this unfold with a mix of relief and unease. Lena had shifted something, not enough to fix the system, enough to disrupt its rhythm. One evening, Morales received a message from the journalist who had broken the story. It contained a single photo, a small memorial card left at the motel. Someone had written beneath the plaque, "She believed us." Morales stared at it for a long time, because that sentence inverted everything. Lena hadn't just recorded a confession, she had believed the truth mattered, even when the system didn't. Park closed the oversight report with a conclusion that avoided drama and landed harder because of it. The most dangerous assumption in institutional justice is that silence equals resolution. The executive's family settled multiple civil suits quietly. Assets were liquidated, foundations rebranded. The name that once opened doors now closed them, not through outrage, through discomfort. People didn't want to be associated with the story. And stories lose power when they're hidden, but gain consequence when no one wants to touch them. On the anniversary of Lena's disappearance, the journalist published a final piece. Not about the crime, about the decision. The moment a woman pressed record knowing it might erase her future, but preserve something larger. The article ended with one sentence Morales would never forget. Justice didn't save her. Preparation did. Morales visited the motel again that night. Room 14 had been repainted, the carpet replaced, new management. Nothing about it suggested what had happened there, which felt exactly right, because the truth didn't live in the room. It lived in what Lena had left behind and what she had forced others to confront. The system hadn't changed because it felt bad. It had changed because pretending nothing happened was no longer an option. And that was Lena's real legacy, not martyrdom, not tragedy, disruption. Morales didn't feel victorious. That's what surprised him most. The case had produced arrests, reports, public outrage, consequences, a chain of approvals exposed. A pattern named loudly enough that it couldn't slip back into the dark. And still, when Morales walked into the station for the first time after the captain's subpoena, the air felt the same. Polite, controlled, professional enough to hide resentment. A few people congratulated him quietly. Others avoided eye contact. Some looked at him like he'd committed a social crime by refusing to let the story die cleanly. Morales understood why. He hadn't just made enemies of a wealthy family, he'd embarrassed a system that prided itself on appearing intact. Park warned him early, "Institutions forgive scandals, they don't forgive embarrassment." She was right. Morales was invited into a meeting with leadership, supposedly a debrief. It wasn't a debrief, it was a test. They thanked him for his dedication, praised his initiative, then offered him a transfer to a different division in another city. A promotion on paper, a relocation in practice, a clean way to move him out of the blast radius. Morales kept his voice neutral. "Why now?" A deputy chief smiled the way people smile when they're pretending something is generous. "Fresh start," the deputy said. Morales nodded slowly. "Or exile." The smile tightened. Park had her own version of exile. Oversight officials praised her report publicly, but internally she was treated like a live wire, valuable until touched. Her access requests suddenly required double approval. Her meetings were rescheduled last minute. People she'd worked with for years began replying to emails with single sentences. Not refusal, delay. The softest form of obstruction. Quiet retaliation, Park called it. The kind that never becomes evidence. But then the unexpected happened. Someone approached Morales. Not a rookie, not a whistleblower with nothing to lose. A senior administrator from records, someone who had survived 3 chiefs and 2 corruption scandals by mastering the art of appearing invisible. He asked Morales to meet him in the parking garage after hours. Morales went. The man didn't offer a handshake. He didn't sit. He stood beside a concrete pillar, like he was afraid the wrong posture could be interpreted as an admission. "I didn't delete the motel footage," the man said. "But I saw who requested the deletion pathway." Morales kept his voice calm. "Who?" The administrator swallowed. "It wasn't the captain." Morales's stomach tightened. "Then who?" The man stared at the ground. "It was a legal liaison," he said. "Someone assigned to coordinate media exposure." Morales didn't speak. The administrator continued, voice shaking slightly. "He didn't issue the request directly. He used a workaround, an internal form that doesn't get logged the same way. It's meant for emergency privacy situations." Morales felt his pulse climb. "Name." The administrator hesitated. Then he spoke it, a name Morales recognized from Park's report. Not the family's attorney, not the private investigator. A departmental liaison whose job was to make problems less visible. Morales stared at him. "Why are you telling me now?" The man's eyes flicked toward the exit. "Because I watched the story happen," he said, voice low. "And I realized we've been doing this for years. I didn't want to be the person who pretends he didn't notice anymore." Morales took out his phone. "Say it again on record." The administrator flinched. "No," he whispered. "I can't." Morales's jaw tightened. "Then it doesn't help." The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, worn at the edges. "It helps," he said, "because I copied this months ago." Morales unfolded it. It was an internal memo. Short, clinical. It contained a line that made Morales's skin turn cold. Secondary individual must be neutralized before narrative becomes primary. There it was again. Secondary individual. Lena. But now the memo had something the public had never seen. A signature block, not the captain's, not the PI's, the liaison. Morales felt anger rise, pure, steady. This wasn't incompetence, this was a function. He looked up. "Why didn't you give this to Park?" The administrator's voice was tight. "Because Park is visible," he said, "and visibility makes targets." Morales understood the logic. It was the same logic Lena had used. Preparation over hope. He folded the memo carefully. "I'm going to protect you," Morales said. The man shook his head. "No," he replied. "You're going to protect the truth." Morales left the garage and called Park immediately. She didn't speak at first. When he explained what he had, he heard her breathing slow, like she was forcing herself not to react emotionally. "This changes the chain," Park said finally. "It proves the system wasn't just looking away," Morales replied. "It was steering." Park's voice went sharper. "We need it authenticated." Morales stared into the darkness beyond his apartment window. "If we try to authenticate it through the department, they'll bury it." Park paused. "Then we do what Lena did." Morales's throat tightened. "We make it impossible to bury." Park's voice lowered. "We give it to the journalist." Morales hesitated, because that move would start a new fire, and fires didn't always burn the right people. But then he remembered the memo's language: neutralize, narrative, secondary individual. And he realized something that made his stomach turn. Lena hadn't just been erased because she had evidence. She had been erased because she threatened the habit of erasure. Morales exhaled. "Okay," he said. "We do it carefully." Park responded with a sentence that sounded like a vow. "No names on calls," she said. "No locations. No predictable patterns." Morales nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Because once you learn how the system learns you, you stop moving the way it expects. And somewhere, quietly, invisibly, another decision was being made." The liaison, sensing pressure, had begun arranging his own exit, not out of fear of justice, out of fear of exposure. He didn't care about court, he cared about narrative, and that meant there was one last race left, to publish the final proof before the final cleaner wiped the final trail. The liaison didn't run. That was the mistake. People who disappear abruptly attract attention. People who leave quietly following protocol tend to pass unnoticed. He filed for medical leave, citing stress. He delegated ongoing cases. He scheduled meetings weeks out he never intended to attend, and he kept working. Park recognized the behavior immediately. "He's cleaning while pretending not to," she said. "That means he thinks he has time." Morales disagreed. "No," he said. "It means he thinks the system will finish the job for him." They couldn't confront him directly. Not without triggering the very protections he'd helped design. Any formal inquiry would alert legal. Any subpoena would create a justification for administrative delay. So they did what Lena had done. They built permanence before confrontation. The journalist agreed to meet under conditions she'd learned to insist on. No names spoken aloud, no phones powered on, no single copy of anything. Morales brought the memo. Park brought corroborating metadata, timestamps, access pathways, the signature's digital residue embedded in old internal documents. The journalist didn't rush. She read every line. She cross-checked every claim. She asked questions that didn't sound like questions at all. "Who benefits if this stays procedural?" she asked. Morales answered without hesitation. "Everyone who wants the next Lena to think pressing record isn't worth it." That sentence made the journalist look up. "Then we publish," she said, "but not as an accusation." Park frowned. "Oh, what do you mean?" "We publish as architecture," the journalist replied. "We show how erasure works. We let readers recognize the shape." The piece went live 48 hours later. It didn't name the liaison in the headline. It didn't call for his arrest. It didn't even frame him as a villain. It mapped the process, the language, the approvals, the euphemisms, the habit of calling people secondary. And then, halfway through, it showed the memo. Not as a gotcha, as a mirror. The reaction was immediate and uncontrollable, not outrage, recognition. Professionals in other institutions began sharing it privately. Former administrators sent messages that started with, "I've seen this before." Oversight offices in other states requested briefings. Advocacy groups cited the article in filings that had nothing to do with Lena's case, but everything to do with silencing. The liaison read the article in his office. He didn't slam a desk. He didn't shout. He closed the door and made 3 phone calls. 2 went unanswered. The third lasted less than a minute. When Internal Affairs arrived later that day, not for him but for his files, he understood the shift. He requested a lawyer. Park sat across from him during the initial interview, silent, taking notes. He tried to speak in abstractions. He tried to claim distance. He tried to frame his actions as risk management. Park waited. When he paused, she slid the memo across the table. "You wrote this," she said. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said quietly, "You don't understand what happens if everything is treated as primary." Park's voice was calm. "Then explain it." He leaned back. "The system collapses," he said. "Resources thin. Credibility erodes. You have to decide which narratives survive." Morales, observing from behind the glass, felt a cold clarity settle in. This wasn't denial. It was philosophy. Park met the liaison's gaze. "And who decides?" He hesitated. "That's the problem," he finally said. "Someone always does." Park wrote that down. The liaison was charged, not with murder, but with obstruction, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to suppress evidence. The charges stuck because they didn't rely on proving intent to harm, only intent to erase. That distinction mattered, because erasure was his specialty. The department issued statements. New protocols were announced. Oversight gained teeth. None of it felt like justice. It felt like damage control. But something else happened, something quieter. Internal systems changed language. Secondary individual was removed from templates. Risk mitigation required justification. Deletion pathways were locked behind independent review. Small changes, structural changes. Morales took the transfer, not because he was pushed, because he understood the cost of staying. Park stayed, because someone had to. They met one last time at the motel. Room 214 remained closed. A decision management claimed was renovation-related. No one questioned it. Morales stood beneath the plaque. "She didn't get justice," he said. Park shook her head. "She got leverage." Morales looked at her. "Is that enough?" Park considered the question carefully. "It's not closure," she said, "but it's protection for the next person who presses record." They stood there in silence. Then Park said something Morales hadn't expected. "She forced us to say her name," Park said. "That matters." Morales nodded. "Because in systems built on erasure, being named is resistance." The journalist published one final update weeks later. It wasn't about charges or reforms. It was about a pattern breaking. She wrote about a receptionist who turned in a voicemail the day she heard the story. About a caregiver who submitted screenshots she'd hidden for years. About a bus driver who recorded a conversation because he remembered a woman who hadn't survived the choice to stay silent. The article ended with a sentence that felt like a warning and a promise at the same time. The system changes slowly, but it listens when people stop disappearing quietly. Morales closed his laptop. He thought of Lena, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had made a single decision in a motel room at 2:41 a.m. She hadn't trusted the system. She'd trusted preparation, and because of that, the system, however reluctantly, had been forced to listen, not to her voice, but to what she left behind. There are crimes that shock because of what happened, and there are crimes that haunt because of what almost didn't. If Lena hadn't pressed record, this story would have ended quietly. A respected man gone, a woman forgotten, a system satisfied with silence, no investigation, no accountability, no name spoken twice. That is how these crimes usually survive, not through violence alone, but through assumptions. assumptions about who matters, about who is credible, about who is worth protecting. Lena understood that better than anyone. She didn't record the confession because she believed justice would save her. She recorded it because she knew justice often arrives too late, and she planned accordingly. Her disappearance wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was the final step in a sequence designed to erase a problem before it could speak. But the mistake wasn't underestimating technology. The mistake was underestimating a woman who knew exactly how disposable the system believed she was, and acted anyway. In the end, Lena didn't survive the truth, but she forced it to survive her. And that matters, because every system that depends on silence cracks when one person refuses to accept it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. These are not isolated cases, they are patterns. And before you go, leave a comment. Where are you watching from? Because stories like this don't belong to one city, one country, or one justice system. They belong everywhere silence has been mistaken for order.